cast my cares. I will cast all my cares upon you. I'll lay all of my burden down at your feet. And anytime I don't know what to do, I'll cast all my cares
Test. Okay. Good morning. Welcome. We're so glad that you are back this morning. I know it's a little harder to get out here on a Saturday morning, but appreciate y'all being here. And I think it'll be two very relevant topics this morning with relativism and religious pluralism. So we'll have the first session, a little bit of Q&A, hopefully have a little bit of a break, and then jump into the second session. It should be done about 11:30 or 12. But Dr. Howe, so much appreciate having you here. I gave all the intro last night, so I assume most of y'all heard that, but very well qualified and a heart for the Lord. And I would encourage you to check out some of that Southern Evangelical Seminary information, auditing one of those classes or considering even taking a degree there if you're younger. That could be an interesting thing to look at because it looks like they have some excellent courses and degree programs. I'm going to open up with prayer and then turn it over to Dr. Howe. Father, thank you. We recognize that every morning your mercies are new, and so we are receiving and experiencing fresh doses and experiences of your grace. And so, Father, thank you for Dr. Howe. Thank you for the opportunity we have to learn. I pray you open up our hearts and our minds and empower him, fill him with your spirit, and encourage us and equip us as believers. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
So, is there anyone here this morning who was not here last night? Okay, so I just want to, apologize that you weren't here to get the free $100 bills that we handed out. So, but if the FedEx truck gets here in time today, maybe we'll do another round of that. But it's kind of hit and miss as to whether they make it or not. So we're watching with bated breath. So we're going to talk about relativism today. Not relatives, but relativism. What's going on? What is it? This is actually a whole course that I teach at the seminary. So we spend a whole semester on different kinds of relativism that I'm going to introduce you to what the different types of relativism are, at least the ones that I'm prepared to say something about. And then we'll pick one or two out of those and say a little bit detail about. And I would encourage you as you're going along, if you got one of your handy-dandy community Bible church notebook things, what do you call them? Community Bible church notebook things? Is that what you call them? Okay. If you think of a question while we're going along, write it down because you're likely, if you're like me at least, you're going to forget that question because you think of other questions perhaps later on. And so we'll take time at the end for the, quote, Q&A, as they say. So what is relativism, at least for the purposes of what we're focusing on this morning? Relativism about a subject, X, whatever X is, generally means X, or our knowledge of X, is different for, that is, relative to, different people. So that's why it's called relativism. Whatever X is about, whatever the subject, either the thing itself is different for different people or our knowledge of the thing is different for different people. You might hear words like subjective versus objective when people say, well, that's a subjective point of view, meaning it's subject to you thinking this way, but it might be different for somebody else, or subjectivism, perhaps. You want to put ism on it. So it's opposite of objective. For something to be objective for the most part means that it's the same for each. Now, here's just my own personal opinion. You don't have to follow me on this, but I tend to avoid the term absolute. I know Christians will use that term, and I think it can be a useful term, but there's a difference between something being absolute and something being objective. And often in our enthusiasm to defend something we think is so true, then we call it's just absolutely the case. But something could be objectively true and still change over time. For example, if it's 90 degrees right now, all right, has it gotten 90 already? It would be probably in Atlanta by this time. If it's 90 degrees, it's objectively the case that it's 90 degrees. But it isn't absolute because it could be 91 in another hour in a way. So absolute tends to carry the idea that it's invariant, it never changes over time. It's just like God is just absolute goodness, and He's never going to change, that kind of thing. So I sort of preserve it for those. And I rather traffic in the terms relative versus objective or subjective versus objective or something like that. I would also submit to you for your consideration. I don't know if I did this last night, but I find myself often submitting things to people for their consideration. That gives me an out, going, well, I was just suggesting it. You don't have to agree with me, rather than coming across too dogmatic. And also, unfacetiously, when I say I submit things for your consideration, it's my signal to say to you that I realize that there's more that needs to be said about something than I have time to say in a little venue together in an hour like this. In other words, I'm trying to garner some charity. If someone in the audience, say we've got an unbeliever, and I make some statement and I say it with such confidence, I don't want them to think that I think that just because I said it and maybe gave one illustration, that settled the debate. And so I go, I want to submit this for your consideration, meaning, yeah, obviously some things deserve more reflection and argument and evidence and research than we can all rehearse here together. So that's just me trying to keep a little loophole as we go. But I would submit to you that not all relative things are a bad thing. Consider, for example, the difference between asparagus and Brussels sprouts. And I ask you, are these tasty or not? All right? So people have an opinion about it. Now, I don't want to prejudice you in any way. I mean, some people like one of them, some people like the other, but I don't want to give away what my personal opinion is about it, okay? But I'm just saying, so don't listen to me. Kids, this is just a joke. There's nothing poisonous about Brussels sprouts, but it is pretty close to poisonous. It's not absolute, however. So, but if you did get in a discussion about Brussels sprouts versus asparagus, it's legitimate to go, I think asparagus is great, and allow for the fact for somebody to go, I think they taste terrible. There's nothing surprising about that. In other words, there are some things that are different to different people. Now, what isn't different is Richard thinks asparagus tastes great. That's the same for everybody. In other words, the asparagus doesn't taste great for everybody, but the statement, or Richard thinks asparagus tastes great, that's true for objectively speaking, because that's just a fact of reality that I like the taste of asparagus. But I can't stand Brussels sprouts. In fact, the Brussels sprouts, Brussels sprouts actually came into existence right at the fall. So the thorns and thistles, those are the Hebrew words, can be translated Brussels sprouts. I think that's probably true. So you could probably think of a lot of things. Is the water deep or shallow? If somebody asks, well, how far do you have to go before it starts getting really deep? Well, it would depend on whether you ask the father or the daughter there, right? As far as what is deep. Because it's relative to their height. You could think of a number of them. Is this big or little? Well, the baby elephant, doesn't it look little? When you see a baby elephant, it just looks little. But it's a lot bigger than that spider. But the spider just looks big. Well, what's going on? Because for a spider, that's pretty big. I don't even know if that's real. That might have just been photoshopped. For an elephant, a baby elephant is small. So relative to what an elephant is, you would use different words for big or different bigger, little, relative again to the situation of the kind of thing that you're talking about. So in that regard, I think it's completely innocent. And I'm going to say some more things about relativism specifically, and then in the second session, I'm going to give a sort of an even more insidious form of relativism with respect to religion. That'll be the second session that we get into. So I've hinted at some of this maybe in what I've said, but let me make it a little bit more explicit. And that's the difference between relativism, skepticism, and then pluralism. What's going on here? Well, relativism is that a relativism about something we said is that it's concerned illicitly. Let me start over. Had to back up. The relativism about which we're concerned, so we're not concerned about the relativism, is that deep or shallow, is that big or little, is it, tastes good or not. We're not concerned about that. The relativism we're concerned illicitly regards an objective X as if it were merely relative, like, does God exist? Well, it's nonsense to go, well, there's a God for you, but there's not a God for me. Norm Geisler, my mentor, co-founder of our seminary, told a story where he was at a college campus, and he gave, I think, a lecture on the resurrection, maybe Easter time, and a student came up to him afterwards and said, that's all fine and good, but that's your truth, that's not my truth. And that was the first time, and I don't know what year this was that happened to him, that he had encountered this relativism about truth. All right? Not a relativism about Brussels sprouts and asparagus, but a relativism about an assertion about an objective fact, namely, did Jesus rise from the dead? It's either true that Jesus rose from the dead, or it's false that he rose from the dead. It's either true that God exists, or it's false. It's either true the sun is the center of the solar system, or it's false. Lots of facts about reality that have to be either true or false. It can't be true for one person and false for another. So this sort of relativism we're concerned about is when they try to take objective things and then say, no, those are themselves relative. That's what I'm going to quarrel with as we go along. We'll pick a few out as we go. So I've already told you about the subjectivism thing, but what is skepticism? Skepticism would grant that there may be an objective truth about a matter, but that we can't know what that truth is. That's generally what a skeptic. They say, I don't know. And as I mentioned last night, there's a scale, a spectrum on skepticism, because some skeptics would just say, I don't know, but I'm open to the evidence. If I hear it, I've never heard it, and I'm not convinced, but that. But some skeptics would say, we can't know. You don't know either. And when you say you do, that's a kind of more of an aggressive form of skepticism. So people are that way some about the existence of God. I don't know whether there's a God, but I don't think you know either, kind of an attitude. So that's not quite the same as the relativism, because they're willing to grant that it might be a fact, but we just can't access what that fact is. Pluralism is usually in reference to religions. That's why we're going to do it separately as a second session here. So pluralism, at least in my experience, comes in two types. And by the way, I'm looking at what you're seeing back there, because that's the way you guys do it on Sunday, right? Okay, instead of me doing this going, you guys look great today. I'm sitting here with my back to you. Sociologically, pluralism is the recognition that within a given context, there just happens to be a variety of religious beliefs. So someone might say, our community is becoming more and more pluralistic. And generally, that's just an observation that just, in fact, there is a greater variety of religions present. We've gotten different religions from around the world moving in, and that's probably a great thing. In fact, it is a great thing. As I heard a speaker one time say, the mission field very often is coming to us rather than we're having to send people around the world. People groups are now coming to our community with their religions, living next door, and we can now have evangelistic opportunities with a mission field right on our doorstep. So that's just an observation. It's generally something sociologists and other people would study, to say the demographics and the shifts from across the decades and that kind of stuff. But philosophically speaking, pluralism is the claim that no particular religious belief is any more or less legitimate than any other. That's at least one form of it, that you go, who's to really say? And we'll give some details as we go along. But the idea is it's not something that you can really settle. So let's just let bygones be bygones, or if I may coin an expression, we just all need to coexist. Ever heard that expression before, seen that on a bumper sticker? So there are different kinds of relativisms, and I want to talk about, I'm going to show you which ones I want to talk about. I'm just looking ahead. Let me just give you the different kinds, and then we'll come back and I'll show you the ones we want to talk about. There's a relativism in truth. There is a relativism and knowledge. In fact, I split this into two in my course. Part one, we deal with modernism and postmodernism. You've probably heard the term postmodernism. Post just means after. So postmodernism is after modernism. But until someone has an appreciation, well, what is modernism? What is that exactly? Is that just like technology, or what are you talking about? What's going on? Unless a person understands modernism, then in my judgment, they can't really appreciate what's bad about postmodernism. So we talk about that in length, and I'm happy to try to field a question on it if you have any. Then there's a part two of that where I try to juxtapose the classical view. You remember I used this expression last night, this sort of classical tradition that has forged a lot of what we identify as Western civilization. from the ancient Greeks and the onset of Christianity and the development for 2,000 years. So I try to juxtapose this sort of classical understanding of knowledge versus modernism versus postmodernism. Then there is relativism and faith and reason. I'm thinking about talking about this tomorrow night. I'm still up in the air about a few things because there's a lot to choose from, and it's like having a buffet of a whole bunch of candies for me, and I'm trying to pick which ones I want to settle on. We'll talk about that hopefully tomorrow night, God willing. Then there's a relativism in history, believe it or not. And you see the cash value of some of these questions, because if relativism adversely can impact history, what does that say about Christianity, which is a historical religion? We're claiming that there were events in history from Israel and that God's working through His people, bringing the Messiah into the world, the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. These are historical events on which we base our Christian faith. So history becomes essential to the viability of the Christian faith in the first place. Now, if relativism is going to start to corrode that, then we really see there's a lot at stake there. So we deal a little bit. Relativism in religion, which we'll say something about in due course. The relativism in morality. I have planned, Pastor, to say something about this today, but I'm going to have to see how my time is, because I tend to talk too much and have long, awkward pauses. Are we live streaming today? See. But they heard you laugh, so they knew it wasn't frozen. It's hard, you can't do it. I can't either. We'll have to figure out a way to do that so we can just do that right in the middle of the live stream. Don't tell your friends and neighbors I'm going to do that. There's a relativism and the Bible. We talk about affronts to the integrity of the Bible. In fact, this was the thing that stumbled me in my young Christian life. I was probably maybe 18 years old, had been saved a couple of years in college, and encountered theological liberalism, higher criticism, JEPD, Paul versus Jesus studies, these kind of things. We talk a little bit about that in relativism Bible. And then the last one is relativism in the gospel, where we deal with things like exclusivism versus inclusivism versus pluralism in terms of salvation, universalism, these kind of things. All right? So of those, God willing, I'm hoping to say something about truth and morality today. And then afterwards, we'll do relativism in religion. And I just wanted to put that slide up there because I just like that animation. In fact, I want to see that again. Just say, see, there. No, I'm just kidding. Let's talk about truth then. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Remember, Jesus said, you will know the truth. Is that me, Pastor, doing that? That little scratchy thing? Would it hurt if I just did that during? That way it'll hide the scratchy noise. Is that going to bother anybody? I find myself referring to this verse very often, even with other Christians, when they put an inordinate amount of emphasis on the experience they have as a Christian, to the point where they're endangering the fact that, yeah, but your experience has to be grounded in truth. You can take LSD and have an experience, but the experience has to be connected with reality and truth. And so Jesus reminds us that you will know the truth. That's what sets us free, and the truth is our grounding in reality. Pilate, famous question, what is truth? There, and Jesus didn't give him an answer anymore after he had already answered it so many times. So what is truth? First thing to distinguish, in my judgment, is the difference between a theory of truth and a test for truth. A theory versus a test. What's a theory? Suppose somebody came up to you and said, it's raining. Somebody came in and says, it's raining. And somebody goes, is that true? Is it true that it's raining? And they go, yes. Whatever they're saying about the statement, it is raining, when they say that it's true, whatever it is they mean about the statement, when they say the statement is true, that's their theory of truth. Whatever that is. Now you might go, what else could they mean? Well, you're going to see in just a second. But your theory of truth, in effect, is what you take the word true to mean. What does it mean when I say something is true? How one knows whether it's raining or not is your test, right? So it's different to say, I know what you mean when you told me you thought it was true that it's raining, but then there's a different thing I have to do to discover whether it actually is raining. Or to say it more directly, your theory is how one defines the terms, true and true, what you're saying about it. And your test is how one discovers. So it's the difference between defining what truth is versus discovering what truth is. Both of these are so critical for us as Christians. We have to know what truth is, and most normal people do know. You usually have to go to university and get disabused of common sense, in my experience. And then all of a sudden you start coming up with options that normal humans would never really come up with. I'm obviously being uncharitable here, and I'm not at all thinking about LSU, by the way. Which is another thing, if the FedEx truck gets here, there are free Ole Miss hats for everybody. All these rocks come at me while I'm talking, you know, whatever. I'll have to tell you my favorite Ole Miss LSU story. In fact, tell you right now just to waste more time, because there was a game in the 60s. Some of you may remember this game, and LSU won most of the time anyway, you know, since the 60s against Ole Miss. But there was a controversy over the clock that the Ole Miss fans were insistent that they got ripped off, and it gave extra time, and it made the difference in the game. And somebody got so angry about it that they put a sign on I-20 as you're coming into Louisiana from Mississippi that says, "You are now entering Louisiana. Please set your clocks back 4 seconds." I don't know if it really was unfair or not, but I always thought that makes a great joke. It has to be true. Now, do we have sound, Zach? Okay, because this is just a short little video. But I don't want to play it if the sound, because is it okay? So the following is probably the clearest definition of truth I've ever seen.
Hello, I'm Leonard Nimoy. The following tale of alien encounters is true, and by true, I mean false. It's all lies, but they're entertaining lies, and in the end, isn't that the real truth? The answer is no.
Is that clear enough for everybody? Once I heard that, I said, I've got this. I can go teach this in a seminary class, okay? So let me just introduce you to a few theories of truth, but I'm only going to talk about 2, maybe 3, maybe 4. No, I'll just say a little bit about them. Here are some theories of truth: correspondence, coherence, functional, pragmatic, and power. Now, I don't know if my color scheme gives it away here or not. It's little subtle things I pop into a slide now and then. But I am an advocate of, as many philosophers are, and the rest of the human race is, pretty much, is what is known as a correspondence theory of truth, which is funny. Sometimes when you isolate an idea and give it a label, then people start to really worry about it and go, isn't that what we were already doing before the philosophers came along? And say, yeah, but the philosophers like to label things, you know, and talk about them. And I'm being facetious, but in a way I'm not being facetious, because I think this is the normal way God has created us, is to think of truth in terms of what philosophers call the correspondence theory of truth. Well, what is the correspondence theory of truth? Truth is correspondence to reality. To say, for example, that when you make a statement and the thing that it's saying is what it is in reality, that is, it corresponds, then we say that it's true. That's what the correspondence theory is true. So if I say it is raining and it's raining in reality, then it's a true statement. If it's not raining in reality, then it's a false statement. That's it, just straightforward. It's just I have an uncanny grasp of the obvious sometimes, I think, there. Here's the way Aristotle said it. To say of what is that it is not, or what is not that it is false, while to say of what is that it is, what is not that it is not, is true. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? I love Aristotle. Though I want to give you a warning, if any of you are interested in perhaps doing some philosophy. If you do philosophy too much, then this was what happens to your eyes. So when you see somebody walking around in your church, you're like, he's probably a philosophy student at the university. Look what happened to Aristotle there. Now, another thing I like about this statement, besides being able to just say it to somebody, just walk up to somebody and go, you know, to say of what is that it is not, or what is not that it is false. Or to say of what is that it is, or what is not is true. And they slap you upside the face. Another thing, if you ever walked into someone's house and they have like Bible verses cross-stitched, as for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord. Wouldn't this be cool to have cross-stitched? Somebody walk into your house and go, yeah, thanks, Richard, for having us over to what is right there. What? In the world is that? In fact, this is what it would look like, I think, right there. Now, none of you are my students, you're probably less likely motivated to do this, but now I have to start saying this in class. Don't send me a cross stitch, okay? I've got enough of them already that over the years students have sent me cross stitch. And one guy actually sent me a Yeti tumbler, and it has that from style, not that cross stitch, but it has it on the tumbler. Oh yeah, it was a big hit at church the next time I had it to take it to church. So any rate. So now what does it mean, though, to correspond to reality? What does that even mean? How does a thing correspond to reality? Here's what I want to give you, and this is where I found that this subject ties directly into things that we care about as Christians. Not just the big global things like God's existence and stuff, but now even the more practically applicable things about how do we read and understand our Bible. And I've discovered that a lot of the critics of the inerrancy of the Scriptures, I'm a strong advocate of biblical inerrancy, but a lot of critics of inerrancy stumble over the inerrancy of the Bible right at this point where they don't understand how something could be true in different kinds of ways. So I want to give you a smattering, which is a technical philosophical term, a smattering of different ways that a proposition, a statement, can correspond to reality. The most obvious is literally. You can say something that's literally true, like, for example, and as he walked by, talking about Jesus, as he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew and his brother casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. So Jesus was literally walking by a literal sea in a literal Galilee. He literally saw literal people who were literally named Simon and Andrew, who were literally brothers, literally casting a literal net into a literal sea, for they literally were fishermen. They were all just really those things. That's typically what you find most often, is that people just say things and they just mean it straightforward, literal, whatever you want to call it. But there are other ways that language, it's not just the Bible, I just give biblical examples so it resonates with us as Christians. But how about, and some of these I think are fun, allegorically. You can make a statement that's true even though it's allegorical. So corresponds to reality doesn't mean it has to correspond literally. You can make a true statement but use figures of speech in saying true things. And it's not just the Bible that does that. People do that. So it astounds me that critics of the Bible somehow hold the Bible to standards, expecting it to talk in ways different than humans talk, despite the fact that you realize it's humans that God used when he wrote the Bible. It's the apostles and the prophets. Of course, in fact, if it didn't sound like the way humans talk, that'd be the thing the critics would point out. So when it talks like we do, they criticize it. When it talks, if it ever talked different than we would, or I should say, if it did talk different than we would, that'd be what they'd criticize. So some of these have a noun form, and some of these have a adjective form, or adverb, depending. So allegorically, or an allegory as a noun. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise, which things are symbolic. The Greek word there is allegorumena, where we would get the English word allegory, for example. So it's an allegory that Paul is making about Sarah and Hagar and Abraham and the events back there. Metaphorically, or the noun would be metaphor. This is one of my favorite. For you shall go out with joy and be led out with peace, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Well, trees don't have hands, the critic could say. So the Bible's false. It's just saying false. Trees can't clap their hands. They clap their hands metaphorically speaking. It's not literal. It can be true. It's just not literally true. It's metaphorically true. There's all through the Bible metaphors and other forms of speech. I took that picture standing at Eagle's Nest, the retreat center up in the Bavarian mountains that Hitler owned. And I'm not a photographer. I just pointed the camera, pushed the picture, and it came out really, really nice. So all the trees will clap their hands, metaphorically speaking. How about similarly, or what we would call a simile? So his heart and the heart of his people were moved as the trees of the woods were moved by the wind. Isn't that beautiful language there? Simile. How about analogically? Paul says that, oh, sorry, I got too many animations in there. For we walk by faith and not by sight. Where walking physically is an analogy of conducting one's life, right? The Christian life. We talk about the Christian walk. We don't mean physical walk, literally. We mean an analogy between how we physically walk, and we need light, and we need to trust people when we're walking around. And so in our spiritual life, as we conduct ourselves in the concourse of our life, we have to trust God, and we have to have faith in what God tells us about things when we can't know them on our own, by analogy. How about symbolically, or a symbol? And the Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the Holy of Holies was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic of the present time in which both gifts and sacrifices were offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. The Greek word that's translated symbolic there is the Greek word parabole, where we get the English word parable, for example, translated symbolic. There are symbols in the tabernacle pointing to the work. How about hyperbolically, or what we would call as a noun, a hyperbole? Now the Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in the multitude. We couldn't literally have camels without number. You couldn't have an infinite number of camels. That's just physically impossible. What's going on? The Bible must be false. No, it's just using exaggerated language. That's what a hyperbole is. It's just exaggeration for the purpose of emphasis. It's like, man, there were 1 million people at the game. And everybody knows there wasn't 1 million, literally, but nobody accuses you of lying by saying that. They know that you're speaking because you're trying to be emphatic. Bible does exactly the same thing. This one is very good to know about, so that we can, there's a couple of them here that really come to the fore in the inerrancy debate. I actually have 2 examples of this. Phenomenologically, there's no real noun form. Sorry, I didn't double check my animations before I gave it to the tech guys up there. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good. What's going on there? Well, the sun doesn't rise. The earth actually rotates on its axis, and it gives the appearance of rising. That's what phenomenologically means. It's sometimes called the language of appearance. And even today, the weatherman, though he's a scientist, will still say tomorrow's sunrise will be at. And nobody calls up. I can't believe he's a 21st century scientist and he still thinks that the sun is moving across the sky. Didn't he read Galileo and stuff? Trying to talk to a guy on a PowerPoint clicker right there. You're talking to me on a PowerPoint clicker and you're worried about me talking about the sun rising. But I like this next example even better out of Joel. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. What do you mean the moon's going to get plasma and platelets and corpuscles? Is that what you mean? No. It's not literally going to turn into blood. Well, how can the moon turn into blood? Well, what happens during a full moon? Every full moon, if you can see it, it turns deep red like the color of blood. It's the language of appearance. And oftentimes the Bible will use the language of appearance only to have the critic jump on it, insisting that it should be taken literally, and then they account it as an error in the Bible. Go, no, you just have to learn how to understand various parts of speech that the Bible uses. Informally, the Bible speaks informally. I like all these animations or transitions I shouldn't have put in. Informally would just be like round numbers. And all who were numbered according to their armies of the forces were 603,550. But a parallel passage said, Moses said, the people whom I'm among are 600,000. All right, well, is it 600,000 or is it 600,300, Well, it's just a round number. People do that. Even the million, there was 1 million people there. Well, suppose somebody said, well, what was it really? Say it was 75,000. Well, it turns out it was 75,002. I know, I was rounding off. Chill out. The Bible talks that way. It's just talking normally the way people talk. Now, these next ones then are my favorite, because we all have to learn how to pronounce the word synecdochically. Just that's the assignment of today, is to learn how to pronounce synecdochically. It's actually easier to say the noun, which is a synecdoche, which is not a city in New York, by the way, but it does sound like one. Synecdoche. What's a synecdoche? A synecdoche is when you give a word that stands for a broader category. Give us this day our daily bread. What, I don't get any butter and jam and something to drink? I just got a bread? No. Bread there becomes a synecdoche for the staples of life, the necessities of life. She brings home the bacon. What, we don't have a pan to fry it in? And no eggs to go with the bacon? No. Bringing home the bacon means you're the provider of the household. Bacon just becomes a synecdoche for this broader kinds of thing. And the Bible uses synecdoches, and this synecdoche and the one that I'm going to do in a moment are, in my experience, the most common things I've seen critics jump on to try to accuse the Bible of having error, even still today. How about metonymically, or an easier way to say it was the noun, a metonymy. So synecdoche and metonymies. What's a metonymy? Metonymy is a part for whole or whole for part. For it happened when David was in Edom and Joab, the commander of the army, had gone up to bury the slain after he had killed every male in Edom. After who had killed? Who killed? Well, if you look at, for it happened when David was, he had killed. Did David kill every? Well, no, David didn't. David himself didn't kill. He did it by means of the army that did the killing. But because David is the commander of the army, then he stands as a representative, if you will, and it could be said to be that it's David doing it by means of his army. Even though it says he, David, singular, killed every male. He didn't run around and kill them all. He had an army doing this. It's a very common thing. How about this one, though? This is even more common. This is one I was thinking about when I'm talking about a critic. In fact, it's a contemporary theologian and Bible scholar with whom I've had a debate on this very issue, on the Bible and inerrancy. And he brings this up in his writings. It says in one passage in Matthew, the centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof. But in Luke, it says, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter my roof. And so this critic goes, see, right there we've got a conflict in the Bible. Because Matthew says the centurion went to Jesus, but Luke says that the centurion sent his emissaries there. And it can't be both. I said, it absolutely can be both. In fact, it very often is both. Well, how is that? Because the friends were, if you will, ambassadors of the centurion. And when he sent them, it is the centurion. It's the same thing that happens when they say, President Biden spoke to, so-and-so, ambassador so-and-so, or President Biden spoke to, let's say, some leader in China, president in China. And you go, well, Biden was in China? No. Well, did they call? No. How did he speak to him? Through his ambassadors. When the president of a country sends ambassadors to speak to heads of state of another country, it is that guy speaking to them through this means, right? That's called a metonymy. And so there's absolutely, in my judgment, no reason to regard this as some kind of conflict. It's just the normal way in which the Bible speaks. So you see these, and there may be other examples besides these, and I'm soliciting some of those. If anybody has another example of a way in which something can correspond that is a normal way to talk, even though it's not corresponding literally. Well, what about some of these other theories? I'm going to skip coherence for the sake of time. Not that I'm not coherent. That may be true, but that's a different subject. But I'm going to skip that as a theory of truth. I'm going to talk about the functional. Some of these don't take much time to say all we need to say. What is a functional theory of truth? A statement is true inasmuch as it fulfills its intended purpose. It fulfills its function. This one has plagued biblical studies in the 20th century. It's sometimes called an intentional theory of truth. I'll give you an example. Daniel Fuller of the Fuller Seminary fame. Remember the passage that says that mustard seed is the smallest of seeds? And people go, well, it isn't literally the smallest of seeds, so the Bible is in error. How does Daniel Fuller want to resolve that? Well, he has to change what it means to be a true and false by a different theory of truth so that he can try to exonerate the Scriptures. But he does it, I think, at too high a price. Although the mustard seed is not the smallest of all seeds, yet Jesus referred to it as such because, he goes on, to have gone contrary to their mind on what was the smallest seed would have so diverted their attention from the knowledge that would bring salvation to their soul, they might as well have failed in their hear all the important truth of revelational truths, or all important revelational truths. In other words, the intention of what Jesus said was to get people saved. So as long as that's its intention or function and it's fulfilling that, then it's a true statement, even if technically what he said was false about the seed. An intentional view of truth. And as I said, this has plagued biblical studies in the 20th century and now into the 21st century of the critics of inerrancy. They start go, well, the Bible can be true and still be full of errors. And if you're like me, you just go, well, how could it be true if it's got errors in it? Because they have a different theory of what it means to be true. If they don't have a correspondence theory, then they can say, I know Genesis says that God created humans uniquely and that they are not evolved from common ancestors with other life forms, but that's not wrong, even though it's not true that humans, we evolved. That's what the critics will say. So they'll try to eat their cake and have it too. Most people say have their cake and eat it too. It's the other way around. You always have your cake and eat it, but you never can eat your cake and then have it. Right? That's how the saying goes. And so they want to have it both ways, if you will. Oh, yeah, evolution is true, but the Bible is true. That's what some Christians are doing. How do they reconcile it? Very often, in my experience, they have a compromised view of the nature of truth. In fact, Geisler, Norman Geisler wrote an article in 1980, and I put that article on my website, which, by the way, is up. So GoDaddy and I had a Come to Jesus meeting last night. And I know they were really nice. And the guy got it up just like that. It took me 2 tries, but yeah, it was great. So it's up. If you go to the website, richardghowe.com, and you see 2 things I want to draw your attention to. One, I did last night, draw your attention to the little badge on the right of the icon from the conference, Truth Matters. Click on that. It'll take you to the page. All of the PDFs of these are up, except for the one for tomorrow night. I haven't quite finished what I'm going to put in and out of that. All right? Don't forget, though, you can go to the Resources tab and get the entire one with all of the slides that were left out. So that's one thing I'm drawing your attention to. The other, on that right side, you'll see a badge that just says inerrancy. And it's all this material I put in one place having to do with the doctrine of inerrancy. We're not here to talk about that necessarily, but I'm bringing it up now because that article that Geisler wrote is titled The Concept of Truth in the Inerrancy Debate. 1980, he was writing these and sounding the clarion call that we've got a problem here, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, this is the thing I do to justify my existence as a philosopher. I do a presentation called How Theology Needs Philosophy. Somebody says, I don't know, man. Isn't that part of the problem, or the philosophers? So how in the world could I be served as a Christian by philosophy? And I go, okay, if you believe the Bible is inerrant, but you could only believe the Bible is inerrant, that is, without error, if you knew what an error was. But you can only know what an error is if you know what truth is. But the issue of what truth is a philosophical question. Granted, most people don't need to worry about that because they already know what it is. But you know as well as I, people, and there's so many toxic voices flowing into our culture over the past centuries and even decades. More recently it's become acute. So many toxic voices that now we have to find ourselves contending for things that we didn't used to have to do. And so one of those things, as we're talking about and why we're talking about it, is truth. So if you're interested in the inerrancy issue, then you would do well to read Geisler's article. You can get it off just as a PDF. But I would submit to you that truth cannot be merely function for at least one reason, but many. But the first one is you would need the correspondence theory of truth to even define the functional theory of truth. Suppose somebody came up to me and said, I believe in a functional theory of truth. Oh, yeah, what's that? Functional theory of truth is anything that a bald person says is true and a person with a full head of hair says is false. And they would go, that's not the functional theory of truth. I go, yes, it is. No, it isn't. The functional theory of truth is, and what are they going to do? They're going to tell me what the functional theory of truth is in reality. So they're using a correspondence theory of truth to defend their functional theory of truth. That's the way all of these other theories are. You couldn't even state what the theory is without already talking in terms of correspondence, I would submit to you. All right, what about pragmatic? I'll push these pretty quickly so we can get to some. Today we're going to just do A. Because people stand up and give answers, and we will have no idea what question it goes to instead of Q&A. Pragmatic, this plagues a lot of practical Christian situations, people in their religious experience, in Christian versus non-Christian. A statement is true according to pragmatic theory inasmuch as it works. It's practical, it works. This is what gives rise to the true for you and not true for me. Richard Rorty says this: philosophy is edifying discourse, the purpose of which is finding new, better, and more interesting, more fruitful ways of speaking, and to keep the conversation going rather than to find objective truth. All right? He goes on, for pragmatists, the desire for objectivity is not the desire to escape the limitations of one community. Well, then what is it? But simply the desire for as much intersubjective agreement that we can all be in consensus. The desire to extend the reference of us as far as we can. In other words, what we mean by true is how we foster community and solidarity because we agree with each other on something. I hope that this kind of intersubjective agreement and solidarity and the us there was not something like this that he had in mind. That's not the kind of us that he was referred to. And it wasn't. And Rorty was not a Nazi sympathizer. But I go, well, but according to that quest for truth, then the Nazis were some of the truest people in the 20th century. Talk about us and intersubjective community and all this stuff. But it was morally and otherwise bankrupt. So there's got to be something more to it than just a pragmatic. And as I said, it gives rise to that. So a book that I would commend to your reading is Paul Copan's book, True for You But Not for Me, Deflating the Slogans That Leave Christians Speechless. It's got a new cover now, different subtitle. Highly recommend. It's a really, really great read. And one of my brushes with greatness, Steve, I have a series of brushes with greatness that I've had in my life. So my wife's father is Russian. And Paul Copan's parents are Russian, and my wife's grandfather, my wife's grandparents, her father's parents, lived in a Russian community in the same community with Paul's parents. So when Rebecca, my wife, would go up with her parents to visit her grandparents, Paul Copan was one of her childhood playmates. Thank you very much. Personal friend of Paul Copan through my wife there, okay? Brush with greatness. I got a handful of them. So check this out. And before you read that verse, by the way, I told the group last night and told you who are new, if I fall off of this, we get out early. So, in Jeremiah, during the time when Jeremiah is writing his prophecy, one of the things that the children of Israel doing, not the Babylonian pagans, but the children of Israel, one of the things they were doing were burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her. They were worshiping a feminine pagan deity in lieu of worshiping the true God. The children of Israel were doing this. God sends Jeremiah to chide them. This is an abomination. You need to stop doing this. And they say no. And they give their argument. This is why we are not going to stop doing it. And this is what they say. Back to Jeremiah. But we will certainly do whatever has gone out of our own mouth to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, pour out drink offerings to her. We have done, we and our fathers and our kings and our princes in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. Why? Because then we had plenty of food, were well off, and saw no trouble. But since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offering to her, we have lacked everything and have been consumed by the sword and by famine. In other words, they made their determination about what was true and godly based on how much it failed or succeeded in their personal immediate flourishing. Hey, if I cheat on my taxes, I get more disposable income. Or if I lie to certain people, I can really manipulate them. And they use that sort of pragmatic theory. It's true to act this way, and it's good to act this way because it leads to these auspicious, sort of consequences. You go, that's not the criterion to use. Even if it's true that when you stop burning incense and you started languishing, that doesn't mean that your doctrines based on that are true and that your lifestyle is godly. All right. What about then the power? This is just really quick. This is the one we're contending with now with all of the critical theory. Critical theory, at least in terms of its really deliberate unpacking, began decades ago, and what people refer to collectively as the Frankfurt School, a series of German scholars whose influence began to disseminate in the Anglo-American community in the universities. This was what I was referring last night when I made the comment that the toxins we're having to deal with today are the fruit of seeds that were planted decades ago that back then people really wouldn't be motivated to have to worry about what some of these guys were saying. And part of it were things like having to do with power. Now, Foucault was not one of the Frankfurt School, but he gives a good example. There is a battle for truth, or at least around truth. It being understood, once again, that by truth, I do not mean the assemblage of truths which are to be discovered and accepted, but rather the assemblage of rules according to which the true and the false are separated in specific effects of power are attached to the true. So in other words, the things we're contending for are really political struggles over political powers. Oppressors and oppressed is what he's getting at. It being understood also that it's a matter not of a battle on behalf of the truth, but a battle about the status of truth and the economic and political roles it plays. That's exactly what we're dealing with today in the critical theory. All right, so we don't take time for relativism and morality, but I'll just say this. There are some things that are objectively good and evil, and others that are maybe kind of relative to your situation. Okay, that's the morality part. Got that one done. That was a tough one. Now, we can come back to it, and if you have a question about it, we can deal with that. But what I'd like to do now is just go into Q&A for the next few minutes. So, roaming microphones. And Zach, if you would just hit a B on that and black that screen, I would appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Do you have a microphone too, Ryan, or no? Okay.
Now, I know it was like drinking from a fire hose. I know that,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Kevin has a question. You can get us started.
Dr. Howe.
Yes, sir.
Perhaps my question is from a misunderstanding of the correspondence theory.
Okay, then you can't ask it. Oh, no, I'm just kidding.
But how are statements in axiomatic systems true? For example, like say the premises of the ontological argument that it is possible that God could exist. If it is possible, then he could exist in some world. Or these premises, it seems like what in the correspondence theory of truth makes these premises true?
So I love this question, and it's something that I would like to think you and I can talk in detail about afterwards, right? Because my answer to the question will get at the heart of something that matters a lot to me and why I, in the seminary, buy into, if you will, this classical philosophical tradition. In my humble opinion, the kinds of conundrums that might come up when people start talking about things like the interaction of logical axioms and how can they correspond, or modal logical things and others, Quine and some of the stuff going on. The reason why those things, in my humble opinion, are a problem is precisely because they are modern in their philosophical commitments, post-Cartesian philosophy, if that means anything to you. Now, whatever that means, the short answer to me is that's why I'm a Thomist and not a Cartesian, for example. And if they want to know, well, okay, well, what does that mean? I go, thank you. That's what I would love to talk about. Because I think there's a lot at stake. And not only this sort of esoteric stuff that Kevin's talking about that most people might go, it's just kind of like Sudoku games or something. But I tell you what else is at stake, and it's connected to the same things he's asking about. This is another thing that matters a lot to me, is dear to my heart. I do a presentation, you can get the slide deck off the website, called God Fading Away. And I think Christians would be startled to see how many contemporary evangelical Christians are rejecting the classical attributes of God. We've got a strong contingency of contemporary evangelicals who do not believe that God knows the future, or at least what you're going to have for lunch today, that God can't know your free choices in the future. Now, people like Bill Craig are battling this stuff, but in my judgment, I still don't think his philosophical views pushes the answer across the finish line, personally. Now, if he was here, he could debate me on that, and that would be fun, perhaps, but at any rate. But at least he's fighting that battle. But there are lots of other attributes of God that, in my judgment, they are fading in contemporary Christian thought because of the influence of some bad 17th century onward philosophy that had deleterious effect. I know it sounds self-serving to say, there you go again with your medieval Thomism. Or do you go to a medieval dentist while you're at it? You know, yeah, forget those modern dentists. I'm doing dentistry in the 13th century. So that's more than you wanted to know, but it's a tough answer to give without going into a lot of the details about the metaphysics of, and that's basically where I think the problem lies, is how a person understands the metaphysics back behind the logic. Another question? Now, yes, please.
So, would you say that we're transitioning from a pragmatic theory of truth to a power theory of truth in popular culture as a whole right now?
Yes.
Okay. So how does our answer change during this transition from a pragmatic to a power theory? Because a lot of the literature that's been written in the past 40 years was very focused on a pragmatic theory where everybody just wants to get along, everybody just wants everybody else to be happy, and now we're moving more into this critical theory where we're much more focused on power dynamics, political power, and that sort of thing. How does our answer change during that transition?
Yeah, now this is great because this is where the rubber meets the road. And I think the answer's the same in principle. That is that we have to lobby strongly for objective truths that are knowable to a large extent. In other words, I'm not claiming we're all omniscient and that anybody's omniscient. But what has gotten lost is that the critical theorist is, in effect, denying that it's even possible for normal people to even know what's true about reality. That you're being tainted by power dynamics and you don't even realize you're a racist kind of language. And I think that is self-refuting, for example, that they are in effect saying it's not possible for people to say what things are really like. And I go, so you're saying it's really like the fact that it's not possible to say what things are really like. It's a self-refuting statement. And try to get people to see why that's self-refuting, because I really do believe as a Christian that thinking in terms of correspondence and thinking in terms of there are truths about reality that normal people cannot fail to know, even if they are atheists. You can't fail to know that the sun is shining on a clear day. Nobody can fail to know that unless some of their faculties are compromised. But people are being bullied into thinking that what they obviously knew were true is not true anymore. And I think we just have to push back and say it's not a question of power dynamics. It's a question of objective reality and how we know objective reality. A book I would commend to your reading, and I don't get residuals when I recommend these books, but it was my brother Tom Howe, who has all the brains in our family, of the five Howe boys. People used to say, and maybe they still say it, students would come to Southern Evangelical Seminary because of Norman Geisler. They stay at Southern Evangelical Seminary because of Tom Howe. And his dissertation at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary he did in the 90s, he was the first PhD student at the school. And it's a book now titled Objectivity in Biblical Interpretation. Objective, in other words, is there objective truth that we can get from the text of the Bible? You might think, well, duh. But when he did his research in the 90s, out of 40 evangelical scholars who wrote on hermeneutics, biblical interpretation, principles of interpretation. Not people that just use hermeneutics, obviously, but books on hermeneutics. Of about 40 evangelical scholars, I think he found only 2 that said there was objective meaning that you could get from the text. All of them were bought into things like the hermeneutical spiral, and everybody brings their assumptions to the text, and no one can be completely objective and all. And so he does a meticulous triage on that mentality to try to show that is just philosophically bankrupt, and it's not what we've understood, and it's not what normal people would understand about understanding a text. Objectivity and biblical interpretation, Thomas, it'd be on the cover, Howe. And it will, even though it was written in the 90s, and even though he doesn't have critical theory in mind, he's dealing with the postmodern, among others, postmodern hermeneuticians. Gadamer and maybe Habermas, or some of the ones that, not Gary Habermas, but another Habermas. So I would recommend that as a good straight-on treatment of some of this stuff. And I think it probably could go far to answer your question practically. How do we revamp the arguments to target the critical theory? Because it's no longer just merely the pragmatic stuff we're dealing with. It's a different kind of target, and I think that would go far to help in that regard.
So question on the correspondence theory of truth. It seems to me, just kind of on first glance, and I've heard this argument as well, that it's a really circular theory of truth, because it's saying things are true which correspond with reality, but how do we know what reality is? Well, we know what reality is because it's true. Well, how do we know it's true? Because it's reality. Well, how do we know it's reality? Because it's true.
Yeah, exactly.
And it almost seems to combine what the theory of truth is and what the test for truth is.
Great observation.
It's saying we test for truth by comparing it with reality, and that's what is truth. So how can something be its own test and not
See, that's great. What a great observation. In fact, in my experience, that's what causes a lot of the confusion in the debate is the very fact that people don't properly distinguish what do I have to do with regard to settling on a theory of truth versus what do I have to do with regard to how I discover what's true. And to the degree that people conflate those two, it just muddles the conversation in my judgment. In fact, it's amazing to me. I've been reading, a writer would be writing, and right in one paragraph, he goes from complaining about some theory of truth because of some test that he has a problem with. I go, well, your test for truth is not the same as your theory. So let me say something directly about that. In fact, that's what the knowledge part, the two-part thing, relativism and knowledge. Knowledge has to do with or includes the idea of testing for truth. But the short answer to me is this. How you test whether something is true depends on the kind of thing it is. How I test a mathematical claim, let's say Fermat's last theorem, which is a great illustration I give in another presentation that I got from somebody else. Not the presentation, but the illustration. How you would test a mathematical truth is according to the tools and methods and protocols of math. That's different than, say, how you would settle a historical truth. You don't settle history by an appeal to math. This is what plagues a lot of modern thought. A lot of modern thinking insists on reducing things to their quantitative elements so that they can deal with it mathematically. Well, that's fine, but that's not how you know whether the 16th president of the United States had a beard or not. There's no algorithm for that. And you may think that that's silly. It is silly. It makes it easy to see the problem. But a lot of people will make the mistake of even trying to do tests for truth is they use the test for one kind of thing and illicitly try to use that same test for a different kind of thing. So understanding how different aspects of reality require different protocols according to which we test the truth of something. Also remember, there may be some things that could very well be true that we could never know were true. If somebody said, do you know they discovered that Pluto tastes like cookies and cream ice cream? Well, you know what that means for them to say that, and you know it's either true that it tastes like cookies and cream ice cream, or it's false, right? It's either true or false. But we could probably never know whether it does or not. You could get to the planet and lick the planet. You can't get to Pluto. First of all, it's not a planet, right? But we can't get to it. So sometimes people will say, well, because there's no way we could know the truth of this thing, that somehow calls into question the correspondence theory of truth. They say, not at all. I know what it means for somebody to say Pluto tastes like cookies and cream ice cream. I know that that's either true or false, even if I can't ever know what it is. So I think that's part of what's plaguing the confusion. And in my experience, people that call into question the correspondence theory of truth, very often they just conflate all the ins and outs of different tests as if that somehow had an impact on what it is or isn't a viable theory of truth. Now, is that
kind of, I guess my question there is, how do we get to our understanding of reality without first having an understanding of truth? But how do we get to an understanding of truth without first having an understanding of reality?
Yeah, so you can do nothing before reality. That's the beginning of everything. In other words, there's no place to get or stand from which we somehow then encounter the real. We are already real as soon as we start our thinking about it. So reality is the very first experience we have as soon as we come into existence, is the experience of reality. So nobody doesn't experience that. What we do, and you weren't suggesting that we did, but what we do is we have various debates about aspects of the real. But I would argue, as a classical realist, philosophical realist, that all knowledge begins in what we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. All knowledge begins there. Doesn't end there, but that's where it begins. And I defy anybody to try to show me that that's false, because they will always only be able to begin with what they see, hear, taste, touch, or smell to bring a rejection of what I'm saying. Now, that may not be convincing. I have some articles on my blog you can read on that, not you, but whoever's interested on that. All knowledge begins in the senses and is completed in the intellect. Here's what I think has happened in the 20th century. Because you've got atheists like Richard Dawkins, let's pick him for example. I think a lot of Christians have been bullied into thinking that we can't, if we try to put stock into what we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, we're going to become atheists like Richard Dawkins. We're going to become like these hardened materialist scientists. Because then they'll go, because you can't see God, you can't taste logic, so therefore there must be some other faculties with you. Go, no. The saying is, knowledge begins in the senses, it's completed in the intellect. When I see nature around me, when the heavens declare the glory of God, what I submit to you goes on is it's not just what your five senses bring to you as a knowing subject, as a thinking person, but your intellect is able to take that data that the senses bring, that they don't understand. Your tongue can't tell the difference between blue and sweet. You tell the difference between blue and sweet. None of your senses can tell you the difference between loud and green. You know the difference between them. You, as a knower. And I would submit your intellect is able to pick out of your sensory experiences the truths of logic, that a tree is not the same as a non-tree, the value that a tree is more valuable to me than this rock here, and that a human is more valuable to me than that dog. You can pick out principles of well, this tree used to be that tall years ago, now it's as tall as the house, but it's the same tree. You believe it's the same tree, right? Well, what's same about it? There's something same about it all through. It picks out, and you go, well, it's its essence or its nature. It has the ability to change and still stay the same. And these are the kind of things your intellect is able to put together. I'll give you one last example, because it's out of the morality part. I didn't do that, and it's something I lobbied for last night. It's the idea of believing that there's such things as natures, that there's a human nature, what theologians call the soul, that calls us to be humans. It's different than a dog. It has a dog nature. And a cat has a cat nature. Here's why this matters, I believe. You think of the Nuremberg trials. Okay, those are the trials when the Nazis were brought on trial for their atrocities. The justices of the Nuremberg trials were from the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, the United States. But they couldn't try the Nazis on the basis of the laws of those nations because they weren't citizens of those nations. You can't try somebody for breaking a law of a nation they're not even a citizen of. But they also couldn't try them on the basis of German law because they didn't break any German laws. Hitler retooled the Constitution and the laws for the final solution to the Jewish question. So none of these guys broke any German laws. They didn't break any. They couldn't be tried on the basis of the nations of the justices. They couldn't be tried on the basis of the German law. So how were they indicted and tried in the Nuremberg trials? There was a phrase used. It wasn't the first time used in history of jurisprudence, but I believe it's what put the phrase on a lot of people's radar screen. And they were accused of committing crimes against humanity. Think to yourself, what in the world is a humanity? What is a humanity? Is it real in any sense of the term real? Now, if you say, well, no, it's not real, it's just a label, a cataloging, well, then how can you commit a crime against it if it's not real? But if you think it must be real in some sense, then I submit to you how you think about the nature of the reality of something like humanity. Your thinking is probably going to track somewhere along the thinking of Plato or somewhere along the thinking of Aristotle. I guarantee you, it's not absolute, but by and large, if you start reflecting on what you think is, what is a humanity? It's not the same as being a human. I'm not a humanity, am I? That's not what I mean. So what is it? It's what philosophers call a universal. What's the nature of a universal? And if you think it's real, then you're probably going to be some form of Platonism or some form of Aristotelianism. And both of those, by the way, have their sort of Christian instantiation. Augustine was largely a Christian Platonist, and Aquinas is largely a Christian Aristotelian, if that means anything to you. But you think, man, Plato and Aristotle, I haven't thought about them since college days. You're telling me it's likely I'm probably thinking like one or both of them to some degree in something as mundane and down to earth as the Nuremberg trials. And I say, absolutely. Go read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. And he refers to natural law theory. The natural in natural law theory means that humans have natures. That's why it's wrong to kill a zygote in the womb of a woman, a human female, because it is a human. Isn't that what we say? Not that it will be a human as soon as it gets arms and legs and a brain wave. It is a human as soon as it comes into existence. How could you defend that? You defend it, I think, because it has this nature called human. And then you can go on from there and take more time than you should, as I'm doing right now there. So who's the gatekeeper here? All right, I mean, you got the mic, but who cuts us off when it's time?
Well, we time.
Okay. I do? What time do I cut us off? Well, I was wanting to do that like hours ago. No, just kidding. I'm always wanting to cut me off. Are you kidding? Can we take one or two more questions in, and I'll just try to give short answers. I'm sorry, I'm long-winded. Yes, sir.
I wish I could state this question a little better, but it's a feeling that over the last few years, a whole bunch of us who have been asleep at the switch, just living our lives, suddenly see issues in society that we never really thought about a whole lot. And we're here at this conference, a bunch of us, because we want to become informed. We want to know, how do we stand up and speak the truth? How do we defend what we think is the truth? So it's almost like we were little frogs in the water, and the water's getting hotter. And a whole bunch of us who have been silent before, we're now ready to jump out of the pot and start responding.
Yes.
Sometimes it seems like we're pretty late to the game. You probably have a much better idea of what really are we facing. We see the beginnings of these issues form kind of a crisis. But I'm wondering, is there a big momentum coming behind the few voices that seem so radical to us? Is there this big momentum because of the educational process? We've got a loaded bunch of society that have been taught this, and now they're about to enter the fray, and the rest of us are way behind.
Yes.
What are we facing in the next decade?
Yeah, so, and I think the question is, depends upon if we said, what are we facing if we don't do anything? If we just let things go as they're going, versus, is there any hope that we can stave this off and turn the tide? And of course, obviously, it's just going to get worse if nobody does anything. But there is a groundswell of resistance now coming up. And you've seen as much as not more than I have of moms who have fed up with the school boards in some states who keep wanting to shove this critical theory down their children's throats. So I'm heartened by that. And then there are a lot of great thinkers out there writing books and are trying to educate the public against some of the toxins and things. But the thing that keeps me going, first of all, the battle is, we know how this is all going to end as Christians. So that's our hope, that things could get worse, but eventually God's going to raise us from the dead. We're going to be with Him forever. That doesn't resign us to inactivity. It's just to keep us from being hopeless. But the other thing that keeps me going is what I tell my students. Look, it's just one mind at a time. None of us have to think of ourselves that, well, unless and until we can get thousands at the conference to talk about how bad this is, we're never. That's fine. If people do thousands in conferences, that's great. But what can go on in the meantime is all of us, is just the people that we have influence over in our family, friends, coworkers, that God has given us opportunity with the skill set He's given us, whatever that is, with the measure of faith that God's given us, whatever that is. Everybody doesn't have to stand up and do presentations. Somebody needs to, but not everybody. But everybody just needs to engage wherever you are in whatever circumstance God's put you in, and just think of it in terms of just one mind at a time. And not worry about, if I can't do the whole world at once, I can't do anything at once. Well, yeah, you can do a mind at a time. Go ye therefore into all the world and make disciples. Making disciples is teach the things you have learned to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. That kind of thing. So, I mean, it's my temperament. I love the debate in many ways. But I realize it's not just a debate. It's souls that are at stake, aren't there? And so be encouraged that you can pick up a nugget here and there from being together in days like today and take that on and maybe read a resource now and then. Maybe audit a class from the seminary. We actually have a critical thinking critique course coming up this fall in October. You can find information on our website at ses.edu. Even as we speak today, we have a day-long conference that's going on that's virtual on critical theory as a sort of a precursor to the course that we're teaching. You can take that course for an audit for like $50 or something, and maybe that'll be a way to kind of learn some of the stuff if you want to get in on the fight. So, all right, maybe that's it.
We
Zach?
got one more question.
All right,
here.
one more question. Stephen?
Okay.
Okay, all right.
Okay, well, we're going to take a 15-minute break. There's bathrooms and waters out there, and we'll gather back in for the second
Yeah,
session.
do the water first and then do the bathroom after.
See y'all in just a minute.
You don't want to have to, because then you have to do the bathroom again. See, that's the, Yeah, you're good.